Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for being here. My name's Andrew Keiser, and with me we have the Schwob Wind Ensemble. Today we're going to be presenting some aspects of Chen Yi's Dragon Rhyme. You'll be hearing some excerpts from us, a full performance of the work at the end, but before we do that, just want to talk a little bit about the background of the composer. Want to send special thanks to anybody who's watching over the live stream as well. Hopefully you'll be able to see and hear what we've got going on. It's a pretty exciting piece. All right, so a little bit of background about Chen Yi. She was born in 1953 in Guangzhou, China, which in the Western world sometimes is referred to as Canton, or the Cantonese, that's that region. She studied violin and piano, and she had a sort of Western classical upbringing, studied kind of the standard Western composers and compositions for violin and piano. She was a child and a teenager during the Cultural Revolution in China. Actually, the government was opposing anything that wasn't in favor of the government or sponsored by the state, so it affected what art could be produced. They came into her family home and seized materials, including musical instruments. Her mother was able to convince them to not take away her violin because they convinced them that it was just a kid's toy. So she was able to keep her violin and continue working on that. However, she was forced to work in the countryside, which was common. They're separating lots of classes in China during that time. So there was re-education and was actually at a work camp during her teenage years. While she was there, though, she still played music. She actually played state-approved work songs for the other workers and young people in there. She was able to leave that, though, in the 1970s when she became a member and the concertmaster of the Beijing Opera Troupe, which is important because lots of this piece is based around the fundamentals and timbres of Beijing opera. So her experience there definitely informed what you're going to hear this afternoon. She attended the Central Conservatory of Music in Beijing for her bachelor's and her master's. And while she was doing this, she also spent time collecting and studying folk songs out in the ethnic regions of China, studying their operatic repertoire, studying their folk tunes. If you've studied Bartók and the work he did in the Hungarian region, it's similar to that, but it is reflected in a lot of her work with Cantonese folk tunes. She eventually emigrated to the United States, got her DMA from Columbia University in New York City, and she became a faculty member of composition at Peabody Institute. And then in 1998, she was appointed at the UMKC, Kansas City Conservatory of Music and Dance. She was eventually a distinguished professor there, and she is still there to this day, so coming up on 25 years there. Also worth noting, she's married to another composer at UMKC, the name of Zhou Long. Zhou Long is a Pulitzer Prize-winning composer, and they collaborated on a significant work that actually has a lot to do with this piece, a significant orchestral work. Some significant things about her beyond that upbringing: Chen Yi was the first woman to receive a master's in composition in China in 1996, which is pretty remarkable. Her compositions earned her awards that we're familiar with in the West, the Lily Boulanger Award, a Guggenheim Fellowship, both of those in the 90s. The American Academy of Arts and Letters presented her with the Charles Ives Living Award in 2001, and she was composer in residence for a lot of groups, namely Women's Philharmonic in the 90s, and also collaborating with Chanticleer, a group probably many of us are familiar with, and she contributed songs to their Grammy-winning album in the late 90s. She was also a Pulitzer Prize finalist for an orchestral work in 2006, and since 2006, she has been a distinguished visiting professor at Beijing's Central Conservatory, in addition to her appointment at UMKC. Some of her works for winds are listed here. You see that she was not composing for winds until the 21st century, so after she was at UMKC. She was writing a lot and continues to write for chamber works, solo works, choral, some orchestral, but really has gotten more into the wind realm in the 21st century. You see Dragon Rhyme is listed in bold there, 2010, the work you'll be hearing today. Some other things that are worth noting here, you see some that are dedicated to UMKC in Kansas City. Spring Festival is a popular work still with younger bands, uses a lot of the same textures. Suite for Cello and Chamber Winds is an interesting orchestrational chamber piece that she did. Suite from China West is a large symphonic band piece, kind of similar to this piece, but very rooted in Cantonese folk tunes. And then Ba Yin, one of her more recent pieces, prominently features sax quartet with wind ensemble. That's significant because you'll see in this piece, as in many of her pieces, the sax quartet is featured fantastically. Her compositional style, she would describe it herself as a natural hybrid of Eastern and Western musical styles, which makes sense when you think of her upbringing and her education. We talked about some of her works use Chinese folk songs and Cantonese folk songs. However, her style is not maybe what we're used to in the wind band realm, where it's a setting of a folk song. Instead, she embodies more holistically the timbre, the setting, the mood of those folk tunes. Think about the work she did in the countryside growing up. She kind of lives that and breathes that. And she uses the timbre of lots of Chinese instruments and puts it inside Western forms that ensembles like this are more familiar with. Some of her technical and theoretical uses, most of her work is firmly tonal, but uses non-functional harmonies, 20th century techniques like rose and 12-tone, pitch class sets, and you'll see pentatonicism and hexachords a lot. Pentatonicism often associated with many different types of cultural music, especially Chinese music, and it's featured throughout this piece. Getting onto this piece, Dragon Rhyme, it was commissioned by the National Wind Ensemble Consortium Group. If I listed all the members of that consortium group, we'd be here for a long time. But it was premiered by the Hart Wind Ensemble, conducted by Glenn Adsit in 2010 at Carnegie Hall. It's 2 movements without much pause in between, approximately 15 minutes total. First movement between 7 and 8 minutes, we're on the longer side. Second movement between 6 and 7 movements. 6 and 7 minutes, excuse me. So movement 2 setting is derived from an earlier work, which I alluded to before, Human 1839, which is a symphonic work, an orchestral work that she and her husband, Zhou Long, collaborated on using Cantonese folk tunes. If you listen to the 4th movement, the setting is almost identical to movement 2 of Dragon Rhyme, but the theme used throughout is different, and we'll talk more about the theme used in Dragon Rhyme in a second. This piece is based on the style and melodic material, including intervallic relationships, found in Beijing opera and those arias. 2 specific types of Beijing singing styles, the erhuang and the jipi, and those are represented by the 2 different movements, one more angular and a little bit more robotic and the other much more peaceful and fluid. Before we get into any of these specific parts, you want to take a look at the instrumentation, which is reflected mostly on stage. And I'm not going to read all of it to you, but as you look through it, there are some interesting quirks. It is written for symphonic band, so it is intended to be for a large ensemble, and she notates that either one on a part or doubled is fine in terms of assigning parts. Piccolo, English horn, contrabassoon, sometimes, especially in modern works, doubled and not necessarily essential pieces to the puzzle. They are essential parts in this piece, especially English horn, you'll see, has an extended solo in movement 1. Saxes I listed here in quartet, AATB, because like I alluded to before, the sax quartet is a common texture she uses. If you look at the types of percussion, it depends on the mood and character of each portion of the piece. You see that some are indicated that they're only used in movement 1 or movement 2. There is no keyboard percussion besides the glockenspiel. And once you look a little bit further into Beijing opera style, you'll understand why. It also makes sense why there is harp but not piano or bass. The harp texture is very essential. There's also, you see, wood there at the bottom, and as well as included in the timpani parts. So we'll get into why she wrote for that, but she's going for a specific timbre of Chinese drums. And the drums, as you can see, are mostly introduced in movement 2 and not present at all in movement 1. All right, so getting into movement one, we're going to start by looking at the opening texture. First movement starts by being labeled mysteriously. We have a soundscape, this little scrim, that is created by lots of different effects and rows. The first one is on the glockenspiel, and you'll hear a 9-tone row repeating every beat and a half. So Angel's going to play that for us right now. Okay, so we have that 9 tones repeated with occasional breaks in the sound, but that keeps getting repeated over and over again. And on top of that, you see the harps texture here, and we're using 2 harps because they have different some sort of metric ambiguity at the beginning. While there's a 9-tone row going on in the bells, the harps have 2 different meters, sextuplets and 16th notes, and when you combine all of these, you do get a 12-tone composite. So you hear all 12 tones. So we're going to add the harps in and just do the first 3 measures. So you see, we start to get just this blur of sound already, and the winds are going to augment that even more. We see the use of cloud effects, and that's what Chen Yi calls them, cloud effects, in the upper woodwinds. These layered little segments that are actually presented in canon. So we're going to play them for you all together first, but when we play the whole piece, you will barely be able to recognize this. So this happens toward the beginning in flutes, oboes, and some clarinets. So these are intricate little motions that, especially when they're staggered on top of each other, just create this blur of sound. Okay? Once we get everybody else in there, the brass have forte pianos on open intervals, and you start to hear some trills from other woodwind instruments, and you get a rather complicated texture from which later the theme is going to emerge. So now you're going to hear what the opening texture sounds like all together. And so it's at that point that the tension's going to start to build, and eventually different thematic elements are going to start to emerge. The main thing that builds tension in this earlier section is going to be this altered chromatic scale that you see with the woodwinds. So it's actually up a major second and down a minor second. So it's like whole steps that chromatically ascend. We'll hear that with the entire woodwind section here. So it gets a little more chaotic and escalating tension each time. All right, let's go on. Looking at the primary theme, I'll try and get this off of the TV screen here in a second. There's a program note that Chen Yi includes. I'll let you read it for a second. It talks about the thematic material. It's talking about how the material is matched in both movements, and it talks about the description of the dragon. Okay, it says it's auspicious, going from transparent and delicate to angular and strong. Okay, we have the image of the dragon that symbolizes the Eastern culture, and when it meets the world, it becomes part of the global family. So this gets into the section of the piece that is harmonious. So we first hear this theme in the harmonious section from oboe, English horn, trumpet, glock, and harp. And then we hear it up a whole step 3 measures later. Okay, so we have that 6-note motive continuing on, and that develops throughout the piece. It's this harmonious section that is actually forecasted earlier on in the piece. So earlier, after the hazy introduction, we start to hear little snippets, maybe 2 or 3 note motifs, be-dum, ba-ba-bum, and we're going to hear that now. Okay, so you hear each of those little fragments start to appear in a little bit of chaotic noise perpetuated by the woodwinds. And we also see different colors, different angular characters made by a hocket and combination of the clarinet and the brass later on in the piece. So first let's hear the clarinet and the brass. So you hear the clarinet have the main theme, but let's take the clarinet away and see the color that's created by muted brass with forte piano. So this will be just brass. Okay, so it creates an interesting color and some variation not only in the theoretical part of it, but also in the color. Okay, we also see some variation and layers that happen later on with everybody when you start to hear this passed around the ensemble, especially in the upper woodwinds. So you hear this echo being layered on and passed around. So looking at this theme, now that we can all see it, and looking at the intervals there, Chen Yi states that the main intervals that are used are of the 4th and the 7th. Those are prominent in Beijing opera. So if you can see, there's the leaps that are just not the consonant intervals that we are used to in the Western tradition. So it may sound a little funny to Western-trained ears, but this is actually more the romantic aria that Beijing opera presents. So it's interesting to note with the 4th and the 7th and the way that she uses that, The perfect fourths pop up all over the place, and that if you stack two perfect fourths, it does make that minor seventh. You can also see the roots of pentatonic scale here. If you were to organize this theme around E, you would get a major pentatonic scale with an added seventh for some color. And then this theme is dramatically announced at the beginning of movement 2. This is by the saxes and low brass. So not only is the style different, but you can hear that it's more tonal. It's leading toward a tonal center, whereas the first movement is much freer. At the end, when the theme builds to a climax, it is rhythmically augmented towards the climax of the piece, and the highlighted pitches receive agogic accents, and they're made longer. The theme's also manipulated to eventually form a minor pentatonic scale. So eventually it'll go from the first scale degree to the fourth scale degree. A little bit of tonic subdominant relationship. So we're going to hear the saxes and the low brass again later in movement 2, presenting the augmented theme. This theme is actually two of those themes stacked on top of each other, centered around B flat and then D flat. So she's starting to not only augment it rhythmically, but layer it on top of each other. If you look at these pitches, you can get them by stacking fourths or fifths, depending on how you think about it. And this is common in her theory throughout this piece, this quartal harmony, stacking with fourths. And that's the same thing as pentatonic scales. So if you look at the pentatonic scales here, there's a major pentatonic scale on top and a minor one below. If you start on, say, the third scale degree of a major pentatonic scale, in this case E, and you rise by fourths, E, A, D, G, C, you get the whole pentatonic scale. So not only could you do it in a way that's implied a C major tonality, but also in this open scoring that she does a lot. In the minor pentatonic scale, you get the same thing if you start on the fifth scale degree. So Dragon Rhyme uses these quartal harmonies, and like we said, those two fourths can make up the seventh that is used a lot in this piece as well. All right, so we saw some minor pentatonic scales, and we'll get to some major ones as well, but I want to talk a little bit about Beijing opera and the instruments that are used. You'll hear those instruments imitated throughout our performance. These intervals that are common in Beijing opera also are common on these instruments. So if you can see, the major melodic instruments are two bowed instruments, the jinghu and the erhu. The jinghu is smaller, a lead melodic instrument, and they both have two strings. Erhu is more common as a solo instrument outside of the opera orchestra, but when they're together in the orchestra, it's often an octave below the jinghu. Then you have the yechin, a thin plucked lute, and a sanqian, which is similar to a banjo in its size and shape. Okay, those are plucked, picked, and have a different timbre than the bowed string instruments. Lastly, the ruan comes in different shapes and provides the bass voice, probably closest to our guitar in Western and American music. Also different sizes of gongs and cymbals, which are very typical of Beijing opera performances. And then, just so you can see some of these instruments in action, have a little video with the performance from an opera orchestra. Maybe. And if not, if it doesn't want to work in the PowerPoint, I can just scoot this up. Okay, so we see the influence of that Beijing opera material not only in those instruments, but we have lyrical lines that are presented in the first movement, especially by the E-flat clarinet, clarinet 1, and the flute. So you'll hear this in our performance in the first movement. Okay, so we see those operatic arias pick up quite a bit in movement 1, as you can see as they just played. And then we have an English horn solo that riffs on these motives and actually introduces some new ones. And this is where you'll hear some of the major pentatonic influence. I'm not going to conduct this one. You guys just get to enjoy Dominic's playing. Yeah, and it's okay to give it up for these soloists, even before the performance. Yeah, so we heard not only some quotations from the operatic aria, but inclusion of some new material, the major pentatonic inspired, and then the brass picked that up as movement 1 gets a little bit bigger. So you'll hear trumpets, horns, and trombones. So we have that presented in lots of different variations, in the soft texture, in a brass little fanfare, and then the saxophones. Go ahead and combine all of those, and I told you this was coming. You've been eagerly awaiting the appearance of the sax quartet. They're going to play this on their own. Listen for all of the motives that we just discussed. Awesome. Yeah, nice job. Okay, so going on to some more gestures that Chen uses in between the thematic material and the motives. There is what she calls a broom gesture, and it basically clears the listener's clears the air or clears the listener's ear of the harmonic material that was before and prepares it for what's going to come after. So this is based on the hexachord. You'll hear woodwinds, harp, percussion, trading this material and scalar material off, back and forth to each other, and it just creates this nice, literally, sweeping motion. So all of these are just this ascending, sort of dissipating, clearing the air for the next material. So what you're going to hear now is sort of the climax of all of these motives in the first movement, you'll hear the theme, you'll hear the operatic lines, you'll hear the broom gestures. So this is going to be everybody in the harmonious section of the first movement. All right, so that's pretty much the combination of all those distinct layers, all at once in the first movement. Okay, moving on to the second movement, some gestures that you see, they're quite a bit more aggressive. You see, second movement was energetically, and it definitely lives up to its name. So we've got a frenetic descent, and right here on the screen, you can just see one woodwind line that actually starts flutter-tonguing at the bottom, then jumps up an octave and a half, and chromatically and maybe traumatically descends while trilling all the while. So you're going to hear this in all of the woodwinds, and then it inspires this brass descent that is flutter-tongued all the way through, a three-note descent. So you'll hear this from everybody. So you hear all of those figures, and then you still also hear the more tonal arrival, ba-da-da-dum, octaves and fifths. So even though it's more energetic and frenetic and dissonant, it still remains tonal. And just to prove that, we're going to listen to the horns and the trumpets at the beginning of movement 2. We're going to change the writing a little bit. We're going to have just horn 1 and 2, and they're going to sustain their first pitch, and trumpets are going to do their opening fanfare over it. And that's so nice and regal and kind of boring to Chen Yi. So she adds more dissonance. She adds third and fourth horn a half step down, creating more tritones and a little more angst all the way through. Okay, so now we're going to add all the horns and do it as written. Okay, so that's the brass fanfare that you hear right away in movement 2. As we add everybody in, we're transitioning into the different movement. And if you remember at the beginning, we talked about some instruments that are present in movement 2 and not in movement 1, and that's drums. So you're going to hear Diego on the toms start to introduce that dissonance and that fire into movement 2. So this is the opening to movement 2 from everybody. So in movement 2, we have lots of contrast between that dissonance and the tonal center that we just don't have in movement 1. And drums, so that's cool. Drums actually play an incredibly important role, and we talked about the wood. We are finally going to get to the point that the percussion have been waiting for. So the paigu drum is the Chinese equivalent of the toms that Diego was playing, but what you're going to hear from Lucas and eventually Isaac are trying to imitate the dagu drum, which is important in Chinese music. It's similar to a taiko drum, except it's got a wood rim all the way around it. So when you hear them playing on wood, they're actually trying to imitate this sound. If that's not going to work, we can use this one. So it's very dramatic, and you can hear the timbre of the wood is very different. So we're going to hear Lucas, just the beginning of what eventually is the percussion solo. He's just going to play 4 measures for us. Nice, and that's just the beginning of the percussion solo. So it goes somewhere from there, and when the winds add back into that, they're going to actually give pitches to the percussion rhythm. So it's really, as we go on, like the percussion is inspiring the dragon, like the percussion is inspiring the winds. Let me get back over to my presentation here. Okay. So we're going to hear the end of the percussion solo, and the winds will emerge from it. Okay, so that's how, after the introduction, the second movement really gets going. And then finally, we want you to hear just 2 little parts before we get set for the whole performance, where we combine all these motives and listen to the percussion and how the percussion is guiding the wind parts. And then our final excerpt is going to be hearing what all of that does when it finally combines with our primary theme. You'll just hear 8 bars of this. We don't want to give away too much. Okay, and then we don't want to give away the end. It'll be an exciting conclusion, I promise. Okay, so the ensemble is going to get set for our full performance, and I just want to list the sources that I have here. make sure we recognize those. And then want to take some time if there are any questions that anybody has. While we're getting ready for that, just want to thank a few people. The Schwob Wind Ensemble, of course, literally could not happen without them. That would be awkward. Thank Professor Paul Hostetter and Joseph Golden for helping me out and helping to serve as a jury for this. Thank you to Chen Yi for her help in emailing and corresponding with me about this piece. Thanks to Yuji Jones and the Schwob Recording Studio for making all the bells and whistles of this happen. Thank you for attending. Most importantly, thanks to my teacher, Jamie Nix, and my family and my wife, Elaine, for being here as well. We've got just a few minutes before we need to run the piece, so wanted to open up and see if there's any questions.
Yeah, just one quick question. When you were speaking to Chen Yi, because she grew up speaking Cantonese, it has 9 tones and it's a very musical language. Did you talk to her about any of the relationships she might have thought came beyond just the Beijing opera that came from the language itself and how it affected her voice?
Yeah, she did speak a little bit. The question was about how the Chinese Cantonese language, more than just Beijing opera, may have affected the piece. And she did talk about the accents and the rhythmic piece, especially in the percussion in movement 2, does deal with the accented language. So about how in the language the accent almost always occurs on the first syllable. And so there's also a varied and sometimes a pattern in terms of 3, 5, 7, or 9-note groupings that you hear in the percussion. In some pieces, she goes into a stricter detail with rhythmic patterns on those things. I asked her about that this time, and she said it was just kind of following that pattern of the stronger accent being on the downbeat with the speech. Anything else? All right, so we're gonna get set here. We'll take 2 A's, and then we'll be right back with you. thank you again for coming, attending either virtually or in person. Just want to remind you, if you enjoyed that piece at all, there is an encore just for you in a little over 48 hours. Thursday night, this piece will be part of the Wind Ensemble concert, 7:30 in this room. And it's also live streamed, in case you're watching online. Thanks, everybody.